Good evening, everyone. I'm William Lanzillo, the studio coordinator of Sculpture. Welcome to our summer faculty lecture series. I want to welcome our virtual participants watching tonight, as well as our Board of Trustees and National Council. Thank you for your support. Tonight we'll be hearing from artists Andrea Jenkins Wallace and Damien Davis. Before we begin, please silence your cell phones. Anderson Ranch acknowledges that our campus resides on the traditional ancestral territory of the Ute people, who called the Roaring Fork Valley and beyond home for over 800 years. Through our mission to promote a wide range of arts, cultures, and voices, we commit to partner with and honor the indigenous ancestors and residents of this sacred land where we learn, work, and create. Our first speaker will be Andrea Jenkins Wallace, who is the Vice President of Artistic Affairs and the Artistic Director of Photography and New Media. Andrea Jenkins Wallace earned her MFA from the University of Colorado Boulder after completing her undergraduate degree in communications media. Prior to joining Anderson Ranch, she spent over a decade in academia, holding tenure-track appointments at Lake Forest College and Willamette University. She continues to teach courses at Colorado College and the University of Denver. An accomplished speaker, Andrea has presented at institutions such as the Denver Art Museum and the Stonewall National Museum. Her documentary film, Rochelle and Brian, which explores teenage pregnancy, premiered at the New York International Independent Film Festival. Andrea's work has been exhibited nationally and internationally with numerous shows across the Americas, Europe, China, and the Middle East. Please join me in welcoming Andrea Jenkins Wallace.
Wow, a lot of faces. Thanks for being here, everyone. Welcome to Sunday Night at the Ranch. I'm going to start. I sort of worked and redid my presentation today because I was thinking a lot about the interns and specifically the photo interns that are here at the ranch. And I wanted to kind of maybe do a little bit of a different lecture thinking about how I got to make the work that I make and the trajectory of how things change from when you begin your career and sort of move through it. So one of the things that I like to talk about is that before I even had a camera, I think what influenced me most in terms of visual literacy were the photo albums that I grew up with. And I grew up with my mother and my grandmother in my grandmother's house, and she was the caretaker of the family archives or the family photo album. So I grew up looking at images of my mother, and her siblings, and trying to sort of make sense of who they were and who I knew them to be as adults. And so I spent hours looking at these photographs. This is my grandmother. And thinking about really starting to appreciate the formal and the emotional aspects of portraiture. And these are the kinds of images. This is my mother and my aunt, who's a little bit older than my mother. But it was in this way that storytelling through pictures really started to enter into my consciousness. And starting to think about how photography can construct and curate a story. And sometimes it's an actual story and it's actual, and sometimes it's a myth of who we are or who we think we are. And so these are the kinds of images that I grew up with, and I think one of the things I started to think about too was the power of photography to preserve that moment from supersession and from, the memories that otherwise could be lost through time or trauma. And this is my mother and her brother. So this is my mother. So those are the kinds of photographs that I grew up with. And it wasn't until sort of years later when I started to more, formally study photography that I realized those images really made a profound impact on me and on the way I think about images and the way I think about narrative and storytelling. So for many years, I worked as a photojournalist right out of undergraduate, and then really pursued documentary photography. And I did that for many years until I became pregnant and became a single mother. I was married and I got divorced, and I couldn't travel anymore, and I couldn't go away because I had this child. And so the camera that for so long looked outward really started to look inward. And I started to make images about my own family, my mother, my son, and just the emotional landscape of our daily lives. And so and the reason I'm going to show you just a couple of these images to move to the project that I really want to share with you that I've been working on for 15 years. But I started to make these portraits, and this was at a time when I was really struggling, with a lot of grief and a lot of pain. My mother was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. I was a single mother. I was going through, a separation, a divorce. So there was just a lot, and I started to use the camera to try to help me process and move through this. So this is one of the first pieces I made that was really looking back at my own family, and it was, my mother and my son and myself. And that led into a project where I started making these self-portraits, trying to just kind of process a lot of what was happening and processing a lot of grief. And so I made these portraits, these self-portraits, and I was really just trying to just turn the camera back on myself. And at the same time, I had this young child, and I realized, this is what I was connected to through all of this grief. And so I started to make images of him, and sometimes I was in the image. This is called The Kiss. And I was also started making pictures of his best friend, and this is Nikolai. So, and as a mother, being an artist and photographing your own child is something that I started to do, but it's fraught with all kinds of tension. Are you the mother? Are you the photographer? And sometimes there was a real pull-push there. But I started to make these images of my son. And as the time went on and I started to photograph him and I started to photograph his best friend, I realized there was a whole project here. And this is the project that I want to share with you. And I'll show you just a selection of images from this 15 years. But the idea of this was to really start to kind of study the emotional language of boys and their intimacy and their connection and their vulnerability. And so I started to do these portraits of Bo and Nikolai. And at this time, I think Bo is about 4 or 5, and Nikolai's a year older. So they're about 16 months apart. And I think in the early images, you see, and sometimes I photographed them as single images, and sometimes I made portraits of them together. But you see this idea of a vulnerability and a softness, I think, in their bodies. And at times, I would photograph them, in whatever they were doing. And in other times, I would really construct these tableaus or these ideas of what I wanted to photograph and how I wanted to portray them. And I wanted to get at this idea of just the intimacy of childhood and the softness of them. And I think as you look at the work, there's a fluidity and an androgyny in the early images, and there's a physical closeness with the two of them that speaks kind of to that natural intimacy of childhood. And then as the time goes on, I mean, there are times when they're lying together, they're holding hands, or very close. And as time goes on, there's kind of a quiet shift that occurs. And their gestures grow a little bit, stiller, and their glances are a little, as they grow. And the other thing, too, I would talk about is that the thing I was really thinking about, too, is this construction of identity and construction of masculinity and femininity. And there's a sense of, I guess when I think about Beau and I look at some of the early images, or Nikolai didn't have a haircut until he was 10. And so it was this idea of like kind of a freedom, I think, until then. And Beau, he is raised, primarily by his mother, so with a really strong maternal influence. And he doesn't have a relationship with his biological father, so the father figure in his life at that time, or to today, aside from his stepfather, is someone who's Scottish and very soft and not like stereotypically, traditionally performative as masculine. So as they start to move through, and then Nikolai had his hair cut, you still see that softness and the tenderness between them. But you can start to see also Nikolai start to take on a little bit of a more maybe masculine persona. And Nikolai's father was a Green Beret. And you start to see more of that influence both physically and psychologically. And I think what's interesting as I start to look at these images is how their identity is shaped by the presence of a father or lack thereof. And I think also that the contrast between them becomes more pronounced over time. And it's not a rupture, but more of like a divergence as they start to take on their own identities. This is Nikolai. So I guess the other thing is I start to think about is about gender and about how it's in many ways performative and in many ways inherited. And of course, if I just think about some of the formal aspects of my work, I'm definitely influenced by painting, about form, light, the formal aspects of portraiture. And I would also say that the physicality and sensuality is something that I wanted to talk about in these images. And you can see as it goes on, Nikolai has more like military garb. And you can see Beau is much smaller than Nikolai for a long time. Beau had a condition where he didn't grow for several years and for a long time, so he was much smaller. And Nikolai was almost like this, even though he was a year apart, but kind of the caretaker. This is Beau. Let's go through some of these. So, I guess I think about too about how images, there's as much that's revealed as withheld, and that's also and the idea of the layering of meaning is something I've looked at. And again, just looking at these really small gestures, the tilt of the head, the hands, the finger touching Nikolai, like these really small things, but also looking at their physicality as they're starting to grow and change. Almost. And then COVID, and so we couldn't photograph with Nikolai, so I stepped in. But I wanted to make a photograph during COVID, and we were alone a lot, and I thought maybe it was a great time to sort of maybe deal with the tension of mother-son and make a portrait together. So this is one of the last images, and we've been doing this project for about 15 years, and I feel like it's really approaching a natural conclusion as the boys step into young adulthood and embark on sort of the next chapter. But I think that, and this is one of the last images I made last summer, but I think that the images are interesting individually, but I think it's in the totality of the project that you really see the kind of the breadth of change, and I actually am going to start working now on interviews with them to really get their own words and their own text and have them reflect back on the project and kind of where they are and their thoughts about it. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. Our next speaker will be Damien Davis, who is teaching sculptural painting this week. Davis is a Newark-based artist and curator whose work recontextualizes cultural symbols to challenge identity and history. He has exhibited at institutions nationally and internationally, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Museum of Art and Design. Davis holds a master's degree in visual arts administration from NYU. Please join me in welcoming Damien.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay. Beautiful work, by the way, like gorgeous. There was something that you said that resonated with me, this idea of storytelling through images that I feel might be the through line with what we're doing today. So I think it's up. Okay. I haven't necessarily thought through how to circle around these different projects that I'm going to be moving through, so I think the thing to do is to just move through them. So I'm going to give a little bit of background only because I think that it's relevant to the way that I think about my work and the way that I hope that the work operates. I was born in Louisiana, raised in Phoenix, Arizona. I had an older brother who lived with sickle cell, bear with me. So both my brother and I were C-section babies. So my mother thought it would be easier to remember my birthday if she just added a 1 to each number in my brother's birthday. So he was born October 26, 83. I was born November 27th, 84. Because of his sickle cell, my mother and my father and him would spend a lot of time going in and out of hospitals. And are people familiar with sickle cell? Do we know what it is? Sickle cell is exactly that. It is a blood condition where your blood cells are shaped like sickles, so they have a hard time moving through your bloodstream. And because of that, you can experience these bouts of very intense pain, known as sickle cell crises. Those crises are susceptible to dramatic temperature shifts, so because of that, my dad asked for a transfer to Phoenix, which is where I grew up. From Phoenix, I went to NYU for undergrad, and then was forced to drop out of school for a time and live with a cousin in Harlem. After a month, that cousin changed the locks and then outed me to my parents. So I spent a period of time not having a place to live. It was during that time that I got a job working in the art department at NYU and was able to use the tuition remission from that job to finish my bachelor's degree and get a master's degree in visual arts administration. So my master's training is not in being a maker, it's in grant writing, fundraising, strategic planning, all these things that art school typically doesn't teach artists how to do, but artists very much need to know how to do in order to maintain a professional career. I say all that because I think or believe that the art world and maybe the world in general has been making it very difficult to sort of be in a space like this, to even be in a position to make work. So a lot of what I've accomplished has been a result of me having to be my own advocate, be my own mentor, be all of these things. What you're looking at is a print from 2015. This was shortly after I had finished my master's degree and recommitted to making art, believing that I didn't have to wait for anybody to decide that I was good enough to just start making the things that sort of felt right to me. I had always been interested in language, specifically the ways that language fails us, the way that it betrays us, the way that it's constantly messy. And I've been largely interested in working through that by developing this loosely fixed lexicon of shapes that have been developing over time. So what you're looking at here are some of the earliest shapes that are born out of trying to understand the way in which Black people are depicted, categorized, maybe fetishized, or sort of othered throughout history. And what became sort of interesting is the way in which a lot of these shapes sort of came down to issues of currency. So not just physical currency or money as currency, but emotional currency, sexual currency, things of that nature. I'm gonna get this out of the way because it feels still kind of embarrassing. This is that print at the Met next to Kara Walker. It still feels kind of surreal that it happened, but I also, and I only put it in there because I think that it kind of speaks to the relationship that artists typically have with curators. The curator for this show was someone who supported the work very early on through a residency that I had participated in. So for 10 years later to see this print in this space was kind of an amazing thing, but also at the same time an opportunity for me to reflect on my practice, which has moved beyond just sort of flat work into three-dimensional forms. So all through, it's like not tall enough, this thing. I'll just a little shorter. All right. So I've always been interested in technology. I grew up as a Star Trek kid. Any Star Trek fans? Deep Space Nine? Correct. Always interested in lasers, vectors, lines, mathematics. But in a lot of ways, it was kind of born out of a frustration I had in art school about a lack or a thing that was missing. In art school, it was very frustrating because there were oftentimes, almost all of the time, it was very difficult to sort of see myself or see my history as a Black queer person in the information that was being delivered to me, in the lessons that were being taught, in the information that was being provided. So a lot of my work since coming out of grad school, after coming to this realization that I can make work about whatever I want and not have to play by these same rules, has been about doing this sort of investigative work, either introspectively in my own sort of lived experience and familial history, or through sort of shared histories through queer communities, Black communities, et cetera. So there's a couple sort of quick projects that I'll show you. This project was born out of interviews that I did with my mother on her experiences dealing with the healthcare system while protecting my brother. So there were many instances where, she would have to dismiss the nurse from the hospital room because the thing that the nurse was doing was actually causing more pain for my brother. And expanding that conversation into sort of bigger issues around sort of blackness in healthcare, black women specifically not being believed when they discuss their pain or are looking for management of their pain, things like that. Other projects like this have been more outward looking. This was for an exhibition at the Sugar Hill Children's Museum in Harlem. And this piece is sort of an exploration of Mae Jemison, who was the first black woman in outer space. One of the things that people don't know about Mae Jemison, or astronauts in general, is that they're allowed to take all these personal items with them up into space. So one of the objects that Mae Jemison took with her was this African carving. So I love this idea of this African carving just sort of floating around in space. But also, at the time, I was also curating at this museum, so there was an opportunity to show kids in Harlem alternative pathways or opportunities for them to see themselves, not just in outer space, but in all these other ways in STEM, working with materials or technologies that might seem out of reach in one way or another. So this is where we get to like the real projects. This was a project I did at the Whitney Museum. It was part of a series called Study Sessions, taking the idea from Fred Moten with this idea that study sessions are anything that you do with other people. So this is actually a study session right now. Well, the way that that event works is you choose, or the museum chooses an artist, and then that artist chooses a piece in the permanent collection at the museum, and then there's a study session built around it. The piece that I chose was Untitled 1989 by Felix Gonzalez Torres. This was a piece celebrating the 20th anniversary of the Stonewall riot, or the Stonewall Rebellion. It was a billboard that was placed in Sheridan Square. So what you see here is the original staging of the billboard piece on the left in 1989, and then the restaging of that piece for the 50th anniversary of Stonewall in 2019. What you'll see is a series of words, phrases, statements, non sequiturs that sort of circle around the queer liberation movement. So what was interesting for me was to take that concept of building an idea or a concept, not by pointing directly at the thing, but by pointing at multiple points in a constellation around the thing, and then offering an opportunity for people to do that investigative or exploratory work themselves. So the way that manifested was this 99 component jigsaw puzzle made out of CNC milled plywood and laser cut acrylic that people were then invited to just come together and assemble. So the piece is made up of various shapes. A lot of the shapes are the same shapes that are used in this lexicon. And then after those shapes are completed, I have them hostage. So there's a performative reading of these, what I refer to as like cells that have text on them. So for context, this was 2017. So it's a little bit of deja vu all over again. People were still, at the time, trying to make sense of this new administration, thinking about the implications or the impacts of it, of what it would have for queer and trans folk. So each of those cells kind of talks a little bit about either the queer liberation movement, the sort of politics of New York City and the way that it sort of organizes space. At the time, the Whitney Museum had just moved from uptown to downtown, so there were all these city ordinances to sort of transform that surrounding community. Up until that point, that part of town was a safe haven for Black and brown, queer, trans folks, particularly those that had been sort of cast out of their homes, people that had no place to live. So some of the cells talk about the city ordinances that were used to sort of discourage or push out that community of people that had historically been there. The cell in the middle, for example, is a list of all the trans people that were murdered the year prior. And then there's just an image of me reading. So I've always been interested in how you take histories, particularly histories that can feel sort of painful or fraught, whether they're connected to me or not, and turn them into something that feels aesthetically compelling or pleasing. I love this idea that the work oftentimes can take this sort of Trojan horse effect, where maybe you're drawn in by the aesthetics, by the way that it's made, how pleasing it might be to the eye, and then through doing the interrogative work of trying to understand what these individual shapes mean in relationship to each other, then you're kind of teasing out a connective tissue that opens up conversations or a discursive possibility for tougher conversations to exist. And I think in a lot of ways that's born out of me sort of always being forced to exist in these tougher spaces or awkward spaces or uncomfortable spaces. So there's an opportunity to hopefully create a space where people can find, and I hope this makes sense, some level of comfort within the discomfort. This idea that if we give ourselves permission to be uncomfortable and to sit in that discomfort, maybe we can actually learn and connect more on a human level versus the thing that the internet has kind of taught us now, which is to quickly scan everything that's happening around us, decide if it's in alignment with the values that we've already determined for ourselves. And if the answer is that something is misaligned, to discard it completely. What happens when you build a practice that's about, hopefully, offering opportunities to discard things less? This is a public art commission I did with the MTA in Mount Vernon. Mount Vernon is a historically black community or city in like north of the Bronx. So a lot of sort of local heroes, things like that. The piece in a lot of ways is more just about kind of moving through the history of Mount Vernon. The thing that I find the most sort of important about this project is the history of this bridge that it sits on. So the 3rd Avenue Bridge in Mount Vernon was part of a series of bridges that run across town. Mount Vernon, because it was a historically black community, when they were building the Metro North Railroad to connect to places like Connecticut, Massachusetts, etc., they burrowed what they call the cut, which is a deep trench for all the train systems through the middle of town. So essentially, the city of Mount Vernon got bisected into 2 zones. There's the northern part of Mount Vernon, which is largely affluent, and then the southern part of Mount Vernon, which is not. The bridges were allowed to fall into disarray to the point where the bridges could no longer be walked across, and those bridges were left untended to for a decade. So for a decade, people could not go from one side of the city to the other. And what you're looking at in the top left image is, for the first time in 10 years, a fire truck being able to go from one side of the town to the other. So the bridge, in a lot of ways, is less about what's aesthetically going on, even though it's hopefully resonating with the surrounding community. But the bridge itself offers like another example of the ways in which fucked up shit happens. But also maybe thinking about the ways that art has the potential to step in and do some of this corrective work, or maybe art becomes the excuse to do some of this corrective work. It's another series of works inspired by Mary Eliza Mahoney, who was the first black registered nurse in the United States. This is in the early part of the 1900s, so obviously Mary Eliza Mahoney, despite having a nursing degree, was not allowed to practice nursing in a hospital. So she worked as a home care nurse throughout her whole career. Mary Eliza Mahoney did eventually go on to found what's now known as the National Association of Nurses. Another project, this was at Project for Empty Space, which is sort of a studio building, art gallery space that a lot of people that have come through Anderson Ranch have participated in or still participate in. This was the culminating exhibition for my residency there. It was a show called Searching, which in a lot of ways was a meditation on the word searching, both thinking outwardly and inwardly. The show is born out of an experience I had during COVID where I got really sick, not from COVID, just from other complications. And a friend of mine had come to my place and basically said, don't be mad, but I brought my friend who's a doctor at NYU and we want to take you to the hospital. And I, reluctantly agreed because I'm a bit shy and don't, I have trouble accepting help from people in a lot of ways. When this doctor came to the door, we talked for a brief while, and he then started to kind of like push his way into my apartment. So for context, this was around the same time as Breonna Taylor, Philando Castile. So I did have to have a conversation with my friend about the sort of politics and the anxieties that come from someone trying to force their way into your house without consent. At the same time, this was during COVID, so there was a need and a desire for, I think, a lot of us to have this sense of connection, this sense of belonging, this feeling of love. So the show became about kind of trying to tackle those two conflicting feelings, wanting desperately to invite someone in, but also very anxiously wanting to hold somebody out, particularly systems or institutions of power like the police, etc. So for this show, we blacked out the entire gallery. We painted the gallery completely black from head to toe, and all of the pieces in the space can only be looked at, evaluated, interrogated through holding a black light flashlight. So in order for you to understand the works in the show, you had to take on that role of being the investigator. So all of the pieces in the show had like kind of a double function. So they would operate under regular light or be designed to operate under regular light, but then also be able to kind of perform in this other way under black light. I've always been thinking about a sort of interactive component to the work, thinking a lot about how you can incorporate a sort of non-Eurocentric sensibility to the way that you experience objects. So what happens when it's not just about looking at an object that's on the wall or in a traditional exhibition space, museum space, gallery space, etc., but thinking about how you can experience a work of art in a more indigenous sense, in a more African sense that involves incorporating other senses, touch, sound, maybe even smell, etc. So incorporating some level of interactivity has always been really important for the work. This is kind of the newest stuff that I'm doing right now. I actually feel really lost in this moment as an artist because I've dedicated so much of my work in doing the things that you've seen previously, which is about interrogating these issues of queerness or black history and making them really legible or semi-legible in order to open up these conversations. And I find myself less interested in doing that work right now in a lot of ways because of the world that we're in, and wondering for myself who the work actually needs to be for. Does the work need to be for me? Does the work still need to be about these histories? These works are sort of teetering in those spaces, either thinking about like Black childhood with Tamagotchis, barrettes, things like that, but then also maybe thinking about the more sinister things, like the piece on the right being inspired by the Black Panthers' free breakfast program, where, and this is the thing that we understand, is that children need to be fed in order to be able to learn. So the Black Panthers were instrumental back in the 70s of like trying to do that work. This piece specifically points to an instance where the police in Chicago broke into the warehouse where they were storing that food and urinated all over it. The alligator thing actually happened before everything that's happening now, so there's something weirdly prophetic about that one that scares me a little bit. But now I'm making abstract things. Things that maybe don't look like anything, maybe just look like chewed up pieces of gum. But then also allowing the things to sort of morph into things that I haven't seen before or things that aren't grounded in reality, these sort of weird chimeras. But then also maybe things that don't need to be a thing at all. So this is me telling you in a very elaborate way that I have no clue what I'm doing. But I am open to questions. So, thank you.
Thank you so much. We have time for some questions. So if you have a question, I'll bring the mic over to you. And Damien and Andrea will be up here with the mic to answer.
We really don't need to see my desktop.
I'll let you guys share this mic. And I'll turn the lights down.
Thank you both so much for your talks. I have a question for each of you. So for Andrea, let's see here. I'm so sorry for being so deep right off the bat. Would you ever consider your camera a shield, something that gave you distance or from a grief or emotional intensity, or did it make you feel more exposed?
That's a great question. I think both. I think I've often used the camera. I would say before I started making work about my own family and kind of emotional landscape, I used the camera as a shield and often worked on documentaries with people with stories that were really similar to my own. I was able to tell those stories through them without actually being vulnerable for myself. And then I would say, though, turning the camera inward, I have a friend who told me for years that I need to make more personal work, and I was like, that's ridiculous. And then when I did, and this is also when I had started by talking about, thinking about the interns and wanting to start to talk about the trajectory, being that I never had planned to ever make work that was so personal. I always had planned to make work about stories that might be close to my own, but without anyone really knowing. And then certainly turning the camera inward and then showing, because it's also about what you choose to show and how you edit, it felt very exposed.
Thank you. And then one question for Damien.
Oh.
I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit more about how humor and play functions in your work, especially when talking about such difficult things. Maybe like the moment where you stumbled into being like, oh, this is how I can talk about it. Just wondering if there's anything there.
Thank you. Yeah, I think a lot of it, again, was sort of born out of art school. The few times that we would talk about artists that look like me or live like me or love like me were, I used to find the language around those artists to be really fraught and sort of complicated. Like Basquiat, for example, it was always about the primitive and about these sort of raw, instinctual things. And I remember as like a 17-year-old, 18-year-old, wanting to never have that kind of language attributed to my work, which is probably why I fell so deep into the computer, because I knew that that was a strategy where you could never deny that it took planning, that it took care, that it took practice, that it took, learning. And I think the thing that I'm struggling with right now is wondering if that's become kind of a cage in a way. So I'm trying to figure out how to sort of unburden myself from that. I think that that same strategy of wanting to resist certain language being placed on the work is also why this sort of celebratory use of color, these really sort of rich, vibrant colors come into play, but then also the hardware, I think, as well. The thing that I am really interested in as an artist is how you democratize ways of making work so that people feel that they can access it. And that was one of the things that I struggled with also in college, is having all this information and knowledge and walking into a gallery space or a museum space and still feeling othered or feeling unwelcome in those spaces. So I began to wonder, how can you democratize labor in a way that can't be fetishized in the same way? So the way that we fetishize a brushstroke, or the way that we fetishize a hand being pressed into clay, you don't do that with mechanical things. But everyone can imagine themselves turning a wingnut. So it offers an opportunity for people to see themselves in the making, especially people that don't see themselves reflected in traditional art spaces, if that makes sense. Yeah.
My question's for Andrea. A couple layers. So I'm fascinated by the journey, and I have to imagine when you started, you might not have known that it was going to go for all these years, and it was dependent on this friendship, right, which you had no control over. So there's like this dialogue of your work, but then also this relationship. So I was just curious, kind of two parts. Was there any kind of gaps either or transition in their friendship where there was a timeout in the work, or where your work evolved because of that? And then what is their relationship today?
So, yes, there have been sort of gaps where Nikolai doesn't live. He lives in Denver on the Front Range. And so there are times when I make a lot more work about Bo and single images because I have had access to him. But for the most part, Nikolai has been pretty consistent and has lived with us in the summers. So that's when I've made my work. But I think that one challenge has been that I haven't had continuous access. So there's certain times of the year that I make most of the work, or times when I've gone to Denver to like make a photograph, and it just didn't happen. And also they have become less and less cooperative over the years. And when they were young, I would bribe them with Legos, and then it became just cash. And now, now it's, and I feel like the work is coming to an end. I don't know how to completely finish it, and they're both in college or off, so it's a lot harder to make images. In terms of their relationship now, I think they're still close, but they're very different people, and I think their differences have moved them into different trajectories where there's certain things they have in common, and certainly a childhood of that sort, and they're both only children, so they have that because in some ways they're like brothers because they've known each other all the way through. But in some ways, I'm not sure they would choose each other, now, if they didn't have that history, because they're really different kind of people.
I also have a question for both of you. Andrea, I was wondering, in being a mother and in having a relationship to both of these young kids, can you talk more about, it feels like your motherhood is reflected in the portraits, and it feels like these portraits are kind of a self-portrait. So can you talk a little bit more about your relationship to the pictures themselves as you're making them?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think being a mother, and there's certainly so many well-known photographers that have, chosen to photograph their children, and I think it's ripe with tension because you're a mother and you have this idea that you want to protect your child and engage with in that way, and then you're a photographer and you want a certain kind of image, and I don't want to stop until I get it. And, the joke is one more, because I'd be so close, and then we got to get it. And, there were times when I think I became more of the photographer than the mother, and I think there were times when Bo said, why can't you be my mother right now? Why are you pushing for this photograph? You can see we have mosquito bites all over us and we're in the woods, or when he was younger, he would have a meltdown, and I miss the image, and I was super frustrated. So there's that tension, and I think that's something that maybe the boys now will be able to write about, because I think they have probably very mixed feelings about the whole experience.
And for Damien, I was wondering about, again, like this healing aspect of your work. You talked about how personal it felt, but also there's so much you're doing that feels like you're healing communities and speaking to such broad audiences. And how do you find yourself within the work? I was really attracted to the way you were talking about the hardware and like the connectivity between these layers of color and shapes. So I was wondering how you found yourself there.
Thank you. I almost feel like I can't fully take credit for that, only because of the lineage. So my dad was an electrician and my mom was a home ec teacher. So I feel like so much of my practice is like kind of weaving those two things together. It's, geeking out with my father on like all the technology stuff, but then spending the summers like making quilts and scrunchies with my mom. So in a lot of ways, the hardware becomes like a suturing effect, but also maybe like a stitching or a weaving, and it becomes maybe about quilting in a way. But in terms of the community thing, I think you're kind of zeroing in on something that's really challenging for me right now. I think especially as we all are trying to reimagine what community looks like for ourselves and the people around us, but then also having to ask these really tough questions of like, who are we in community with? What does that look like? How do we structure it? How do we preserve it and protect it? And I'm not, and this is just me being like really honest with you, I'm not sure if the physical work is the space for that, at least right now. Because we also went through all this a while ago, and I thought that doing that with the work was gonna be the thing. And I think in some ways it was helpful for people to see themselves in the work, but at the same time, we find ourselves going through the same things over and over again. So to continue working in that way would be a little crazy, right? So yeah, I don't know. I think that, and this is me kind of talking to all of you right now, I think that you have to figure out what your work needs to be for you. For some of you, it's gonna be about coalition building, community building. For some of you, it's gonna be about really deep introspective work. For some of you, it's gonna be about escape. And I think all of those ways of making work are totally valid.
Thank you so much for sharing. I have a question for the both of you. Your work ties so much to your personal life, and I'm wondering how you each navigate the vulnerableness of yourself and your practice, and if there's been difficulties you've faced in sharing your vulnerabilities.
Um, yeah. Yeah, I think that the personal part of it is exactly. I do sincerely believe that vulnerability can be a strength. And I think that a lot of that might actually just be a byproduct of existing in this body. I know what it's like to be the scary thing walking down the street at night, but I also know what it's like to feel all these other things and to have the way that I see myself not necessarily be in alignment with the way that the world sees me or the way that the world wants to see me. So I do think that being able to import that into the work is super valuable because, again, it offers an opportunity for people to hopefully, not always, like see my humanity. And the hope is that through doing whatever interrogative work my work is propositioning you to do, it's not about even like seeing my humanity at that point. It's just about getting you to do the work of being able to recognize humanity in the things around you. Because I think that we've, in a lot of ways, kind of lost that skill. We have a hard time really seeing other people. Do you want this mic now?
I think vulnerability. I think, as I said, I think for a long time I made work and stayed just outside of it. I made work. I made a film that dealt with like pregnancy and secrets and lies and unwanted pregnancy and adoption and things like that that are actually part of my own birth story. But I made it about somebody else, and it was a lot safer. And now, with some of the work that I made before this project, but moving in, turning the camera on grief and pain and really trying to make visual images about it, I found that it was a little unsettling to show it and, well, to make it was the first thing, but to show it. But what I found is that I was able to immediately connect with an audience because we all have trauma, we all have pain, and I felt that by finally making direct images about it and really talking about it, I always felt very supported and people got it. And I think one of the challenges, I think, with making that kind of work is trying to make personal work but have the images have a universal feel. And that's always been the challenge that I have is how do I make these personal images and have them speak to some kind of universal truth? And I think that's one of the things that we all struggle with when we're making personal work.
We have time for one more question.
My question is for the lady, and you have shown a number of pictures, and they all have the same thought line and pattern, and you said a bunch of words that you shared with us through the microphone, which you could put in writing, and I'm curious as to what area of art this would fit into. Why do you call this art? Things that come to my mind is this a conceptual art piece? Is this a think piece? So can you describe how what you have shared with us would qualify as art?
This is me, but we could both answer this. I think it's in the art realm because I think that what it's doing is it's I think art, there's so many ways you can think about art, and I think it's hard to say something is art and something is not art. But the way I think about it, it's about communicating something in a visual form. And so I can explain the work, but I would also hope that the images speak visually and have an emotional resonance, whether you know the exact story or not. So I think the other thing too is that, as opposed to maybe something that's a more photojournalistic way of approaching a documentary and shooting something as it unfolds, most of these images are constructed. They're constructed images to speak to some kind of truth that I want to communicate about the boys, about motherhood, about vulnerability, about identity, about the change in, androgyny, whatever it is, childhood. So I'm constructing these images to communicate that, and I think that's falls into the art realm. And do you want to say something about conceptual art versus?
No pressure. Exactly. I feel like that's the question we're going to be returning to until the end of time. But is it art? I'm finding myself less and less interested as I get older in like even trying to define that. I think it's whatever you decide it to be, on an individual level, on a community level, et cetera. And I do very much believe that those definitions can be fixed and real in different contexts, but I don't, and fluid, but I don't necessarily think that there's any one definition that exists. I think that art is like people. Like they can exist in all these different ways, and each one of those ways is 100% valid.
May I say, would this like fit into a literary piece of art?
Her work?
Or a journalist piece of art?
Thank you. Sure. I guess. Yeah. I think that. I think art can exist in all these different Venn diagrams, where art can be journalism, art can be therapy, art can be what are some other things? I mean, but also like you all can participate in this. Like, what can art be? I'm actually interested in hearing you all say it out loud. Yeah. What else? Yeah. Anybody else?
A meal.
That part. But yeah, I think what you're getting at is that the work has this journalistic quality to it that allows it to maybe like sit in these other places. And I think that's like the beauty of it. Because also just the endurance of it. Like that's the thing that got me. I was like, you've been in this for so fucking long. But also the subjects too. And I think that that's something that we don't give photographers enough credit for, the relationship between the photographer and the subject, especially a durational one, whether you're related. And what's interesting about this project is that you have very different relationships with each of those subjects. Those subjects have very evolving relationships with each other over time. And you actually... You see it. You see it in the work, and I feel like that's not an easy thing to accomplish. So, if it's journalism, it's good journalism.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Andrea and Damien, and thank you all for being here. We have an orientation tomorrow at 8:45 back in this room, so thanks again, and see you tomorrow.